The European Union has been tested recently. Budget deficits, stagnant growth, unemployment. What is the corporate view on these problems? That is the subject of a report prepared by INSEAD and Booz & Company for a conference in Brussels called The States of the European Union. And joining us now is one of the authors of that report, Professor Ludo van der Heyden. Thank you for being here with us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Good morning, Zoe.
Your report contains some of what we've heard before about Europe needing to be more competitive, but respondents also said that they wanted to see more centralized economic authority from Brussels. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, this may appear indeed as a contradiction, and I see it more as a duality, which is there are two things that are important, which is strong nations and strong regions, and this is the Europe of regions, and then strong coordination and clear agreement on what we have in common, like the euro currency, the overall level of competitiveness. So another way of explaining this duality is that Europe actually has some of the most competitive economies in the world, on the one hand, and on the other hand has some now very problematic countries. And Europe is damaged by the problematic countries, and the very performing economies are actually put pretty much in the shadow. So I think that duality is present in the European construction. It's sort of not Brussels or the nations, it's Brussels and the nations. And I think that is a complex message, which I think is not actually communicated very clearly. But the idea in a duality is just like in a marriage, is both parties have to contribute. It just can't be one side, or it can't be the problem on one side. So, but by and large, what the report says is Brussels is part of the solution, it is not the problem.
And if we'd had a centralized economic authority, do you think that we could have reacted faster to the recent economic crisis?
Oh, absolutely. That is what the markets are asking for. It's actually in a crisis, you of course need some good decentralized tactical decision making in each of the countries, but you need a European response. And I think Europe is extremely complex. And actually what the investors ask for is clarity on Europe, and that clarity on Europe comes from a clear voice, and then especially all the players sort of playing in the same direction, or at least agreeing. And another issue is, for example, Eurobonds. Is actually Eurobonds would be much easier in a certain way for foreign investors, as long as the people issuing the Eurobonds have proper authority, and that actually is the call for greater power and authority on European institutions.
You surveyed these business people last year. What sort of changes have you seen since then over the last year?
I think the biggest change actually comes from the outside, which is the response from the BRICS countries, the BRICS respondents, is much bigger concern. So it seems like Europe is sort of muddling through the crisis. If you go back to the European history, it's been muddling from one crisis meeting to the other crisis meeting, which I think is a mistake, which is it's not that the crisis occurred, but very often the crisis occurred because of a lack of anticipative and strong decision-making ex ante, which actually led decision makers to meet until 4 o'clock in the morning to come to a compromise. Now you can do this once or twice. I think one of the failures in my view is that there has been too much of that, which then causes credibility for the whole construction. You don't sort of, again, you're taking the analogy of a marriage, you don't build a marriage from crisis to crisis. At some point, you go and see someone, you make decisions, or you decide to break up. But here it seems like too many crises, too many last meetings, and especially after the crisis, I would say not enough consistent implementation of the decisions. I think the biggest one, which I think caused a lot of credibility in the world and in Europe as well, is the problem with the Lisbon Treaty, which was the focus on innovation. A lot of talk, it's not clear it actually led to much action.
And what did respondents say were the biggest challenges?
I think the biggest challenges is I think this unified view. So I think what the survey and what the conference does, which is called States of Europe, is to bring the voice of business more strongly to Brussels. Why is this an obvious one? Because the whole idea of Europe was a single market. And the whole idea of a single market is not for more government, but actually a better competitive landscape for businesses. And I think there was sort of a void in Brussels of not having enough voice for business people. And the INSEAD contribution, as opposed to maybe sort of a European school, is that INSEAD brings to this conference not just the European view, but also the foreign view. I always think that Europe is an open place, and we should not just listen to Europeans. We should also listen to those outside of Europe, and what are we bringing to the world. And that, I think, that is the second advantage of this conference, is that it's not just amongst Europeans for Europeans, but it's sort of by business people worldwide, foreigners working in Europe or non-Europeans working in Europe, Europeans working outside, and all sort of judging, you know, the European Union.
What sort of differences did you see in the responses actually from the BRIC countries and compared to America, compared to Europe?
Oh, I think the BRICS countries are expressed real concerns. Now, maybe that's because the Brazilians are farther away, so what you don't know, you know, worries you more, because they occasionally read the papers when there is a crisis, whereas actually we read the paper and there's a crisis, and crisis becomes sort of daily bread, so it's not, you know, it's going to be managed. So I think that is sort of the view. But I think the big difference is the concern.
Mm. And did you see a very big difference between Eastern and Western Europe and Northern and Southern Europe?
To be honest, we haven't seen that difference so much. The big difference is very much between North and South. But that is a factual difference, which is, it's a sad fact that the northern countries seem to be doing very well, and the southern countries, you know, are actually problematic. So what is the result of that? Is the southern countries very much want things to stay as they are and depend on the European project, whereas the northern countries and the central countries probably are more careful and more dubious and more demanding, and probably more open to the idea of maybe shrinking some of the European geography, particularly the Eurozone.
You also surveyed young Europeans. What was the difference of their opinion?
Well, the young Europeans are much stronger in terms of demanding central authority to Brussels. They're also much more positive on the European project. And what comes out from the young view is, I think, there is a sort of general disenchantment with the national governments. And for them, the hope is Brussels. For them, the hope is the European project.
You and your co-author, Bruno Landvin, have probably learned a lot from this report. What have been your key takeaways?
My key takeaways is, I think, that I didn't expect such a strong voice for greater authority in Brussels, in the European Union. But at the same time, I find the voice is very intelligent, which is, it says greater authority on some matters, but greater decentralization on other matters. So, for example, business people are very pragmatic. So they say there is no way we can build a European social model. So decentralize on the social agenda. Let the countries manage the social issues, health, education, welfare. However, much stronger harmony on I would say, the big macroeconomic issues, which is monetary. So there's certainly no rejection, and that makes sense, for the European currency. Secondly, much greater authority, including sanctions for the fiscal practices, and also a sort of greater industrial policy at the European level. But that probably also means, and is not expressed, less industrial policy at the national level. I think there are too many sort of small fortresses, small countries, and certainly what I learned or what certainly I was reminded of, is the European market, the single market, is the best weapon for inducing competitiveness. As a result, the most competitive country, which is Germany, with now a currency that is stable, so that allows the competitiveness to really be declined throughout the European Union, is of course creating a lot of problems for the non-competitive countries. And I think the problem is not Germany, as it's too often said. The problem is that the others aren't competitive enough. And I think that is something that I think is the greatest weakness of Europe, which is we live well, we think we can manage well, we think we even have things to say to the rest of the world, But the first agenda has to be back to what is an old European agenda, which is, being industrious, being competitive, being innovative, bringing solutions. And the Europeans have that capacity, but it's not clear that there is a good balance and a good duality between governments and sort of letting the competitiveness do its task. And competitiveness is a very tough judge, and that is sometimes, I feel, the European reflex is then call on government in order to be protected from competitiveness. But the lack of competitiveness eventually is being paid for by the customers. And we do know customers do not want to pay for inefficiency or for a lack of competitiveness. So I think by and large, this is not a surprise. Business says, continue the business of the single market. This is not done. And basically governments get out of the way. And part of getting out of the way is more power to sanction national governments who are actually too protective of their local industries.
And finally, we're running up towards a second Greek election here, and the markets are very, very dubious about what the outcome of that is going to be. Are you optimistic for the situation over the next few months for Europe?
I'm disappointed by the slow response. After all, I left the US in '88 to join the big European project. I never sort of thought this would be so difficult, but maybe I was too hopeful and too wishful. And as I often say, hope is not a plan, so that we need a good plan. And I think this is a testing time. This is a crisis. And I do think that Europe needs this crisis because we're too stuck in the old ways. We're still trying to do what we're doing before and build Europe. And I think we need to go more into unbuilding the old ways and building the new ways, which is the European way. So I'm still very, very strongly European. But an alliance can only build amongst strong players. So you don't want to have weak players in your alliance. You can't do an alliance, a partnership with weak players. So there must be more discipline and more sanctioning. And I would say I see two options. One is a smaller Eurozone, which is a smaller number of strong countries, really getting together and being in front. Or actually, trying to really be more disciplined and bringing the weaker players faster to a level of competitiveness. And that's an area where Europe can be very, very strong. And I should say I'm particularly disappointed over the last 10 years that Brussels, Europe has been heard so little. And I'm quite pleased in a certain way that the person that we've heard about a lot is Mr. Van Rompuy, the president, who I think has been one consistent, clear voice in this debate. And we should have heard many more, not national voices, but European voices.
Professor van der Heyden, thank you very much for being with us here on INSEAD.
It's a pleasure, Zoe. Thank you.